When we talk about Samson, people usually think of a strong, long-haired man who did incredible things through his incredible strength, but who ended up losing his gift when his hair was cut off by a trap set by Delilah, the woman he loved. So it's common for many people to think that the source of Samson's strength was in his hair. This is even the prevailing opinion among people who have heard this biblical story. But what if I told you that the Bible doesn't say that Samson's strength was in his hair? In fact, this popular idea that the source of Samson's strength was his hair is the result of a misinterpretation of the biblical text. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about from now on in this video. And here we can start by saying that people generally think that Samson's strength was in his hair, because in fact the biblical text records that he lost that strength when his hair was cut off in Delilah's trap. But a closer reading of Samson's story in the Bible shows that this understanding is not correct and that the source of Samson's strength was in the Lord and had to do with his consecration to him, and not exactly with the length of his hair. In fact, to understand the source of Samson's strength, we first need to know why he couldn't cut his hair. The Bible records that when Samson's birth was announced by the angel of the Lord, his parents learned that the boy who would be born would be a Nazirite, that is, he would be consecrated to God from birth until the end of his life. God had chosen that boy to be the deliverer of Israel from the hands of the Philistines, as we read in Judges chapter 13, between verses 1 and 5. Therefore, Samson was a Nazirite of God. And what does that mean? A Nazirite was a vow of consecration to the Lord. Generally, the Israelites made this kind of vow voluntarily for a certain period of their lives, but there were also some who were Nazirites for life, because they were dedicated to the Lord by their parents from birth. And this was the case with Samson. As a Nazirite from birth, Samson obviously had to observe all the rules of the Nazirite vow. This meant that he had to abide by certain restrictions, such as, for example, he couldn't consume grapes or anything derived from them, no leavened drinks, he couldn't have contact with the dead, and he couldn't cut his hair. These rules we see very clearly in chapter 6 of the book of Numbers. And this vow identified Samson as the Lord's anointed to deliver the children of Israel, and Samson's response in observing the restrictions of this vow was to characterize his consecration. Therefore, the fact that Samson could not shave his head did not mean that his hair itself was the source of his strength, but that his long hair was one of the distinctive visible signs of his consecration to the Lord. But given all this, you may be wondering why Samson told Delilah that the secret of his strength lay in the fact that he couldn't cut his hair. Or why did Samson's strength really end when his hair was cut? Well, first of all, the Bible is clear that the Lord blessed Samson, and that the Spirit of God was at work in him, as we read in Judges chapter 13 and verse 25. In fact, when Samson showed superhuman strength, the biblical text clearly states that this phenomenon was the result of the Lord's Spirit working in his life, and not an influence of the length of his hair. For example, when Samson tore a lion apart with his bare hands, the biblical writer wrote in Judges chapter 14, verse 6, that the Spirit of the Lord came upon Samson. In Judges chapter 14, verse 19, we read that the Spirit of the Lord again came upon Samson and he killed 30 Philistines at Ashkelon. Then, in Judges chapter 15, between verses 14 and 20, we read that the Spirit of the Lord once again came upon Samson and he killed 1,000 men with a donkey jawbone. And finally, on the occasion of his death, when Samson brought down the temple of Dagon, who was the deity worshipped by the Philistines, killing more enemies in that episode than during his entire life, this happened after he had pleaded with the Lord to grant him his uncommon strength one last time, as we read in Judges chapter 16, verse 28. Secondly, we can see that Samson acted with great irresponsibility and disregard for the law of the Lord and the restrictions of his consecration. This means that, throughout his life, He broke all the restrictions of the Nazirite vow. Samson had contact with corpses, and not only that. He also fed on the honey that was inside the carcass of the lion he had killed. He also took part in a wedding feast among the Philistines, which obviously included wine and other leavened drinks. And finally, he shaved his head when he revealed the condition of his vow to Delilah. So Samson's strength was not in his hair, but in the Lord. Empowered by the Spirit of God, Samson did incredible things. But when he revealed the restriction of cutting his hair to Delilah, he completely neglected his consecration to God. Perhaps you didn't realize it before, but this means that when Samson's hair was cut, his last Nazirite vow was finally broken. However, when Samson prayed to God to give him back his special talent just one more time, the biblical text records that his hair had already grown back, as we read in Judges chapter 16 and verse 22. And this meant that his vow could be renewed and a new period of consecration could begin. And we know that God heard Samson's prayer and gave him back his gift one last time, causing the Lord's name to be feared and exalted in the land, even through a man who, humanly speaking, was the strongest of the Israelite heroes, although at the same time, he was also the weakest of them, because of the way he neglected the gift he had received from the Lord. For this reason, many biblical commentators speak of Samson as an example of great wasted potential, because after all, despite his exploits, it seems that throughout his life, there was never a time when his people were truly free from the foreign oppression of the Philistines. And if you've watched this far and liked this video, subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments if you already knew that the source of Samson's strength wasn't in his hair. Thank you very much for watching this far. Now for a final message from our sponsors.
Or are afraid of ever developing cancer. I know you keep wondering, what will become of me? Will I be alive tomorrow? Will the pharmaceutical industry be able to create a solution to my problem? One thing I assure you, this industry is not worried at all about you. Think with me, why do you think technology involves? The sciences involved, medicine itself involves. And we still don't have a solution to this old problem. Fortunately, along with my team, we have gathered more than 100 definitive forms to beat cancer, some of them 10,000 times more effective than the conventional way. Do you want access to this list? Then click on the link and come find out. The link will be fixed in the comment.